Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for joining us on this very difficult day for Georgia, but on a very important issue for our country that emerged last week right after the visit of the Prime Minister to China. We witnessed a very interesting development in Georgia-Chinese cooperation. We witnessed the events that were absolutely surprising for anyone interested working on Sino-Georgia relations, academicians, diplomats, everybody in Georgia was surprised by the fact that on 31st of July, we have signed a strategic cooperation. We issued a joint strategic cooperation statement signed by our Prime Minister and President of China. And to be followed by various documents that are considered by this statement. The agreement, for those of you who have not read it, consists of 5 parts. It has a general statement in the beginning, and then it goes by political, economic, international affairs, and people-to-people dialogue and cultural cooperation domains. And it gives all the details of the scope of cooperation in all these important directions for state-to-state cooperation. The document also, together with these domains, lists several several Chinese initiatives and the principles that Georgia has joined and promises to keep as I'm quoting the document, as the main directives of its international policy. Those are One China Principle, BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. There is lots of talk in Georgia that most of the people who've been working on this document probably do not even know what those principles and what those texts are all about, what is the content of those documents, and what are the threats or challenges those documents face to Georgia. So today we have asked our friends, colleagues, partners from different countries, from different institutions, working long time on China-related issues, to join us for this conversation. For the Georgian audience, it is going to be mainly sort of explanatory, bringing the main concepts, bringing the bigger issues of the Chinese interests, Chinese ambitions in today's world. We are joined today by Mr. Glen, who is the research fellow at the Hoover Institution and historian of modern China. He co-chairs Hoover project on Chinese global sharp power and directs its research portfolio. Dr. Mартин Hala, who comes from Czech Republic, he is the founder and director of the Synopsis in Czech Republic. It's a joint project between academia and the Institute of East Asian Studies at the Charles University in Prague. Next speaker is Laura Hart, who is the international human rights lawyer. She acts as a Magnitsky coordinator for the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, IPEC, and serves on Hong Kong Watch Advisory Board. Mrs. Hart is responsible for Safeguard Defenders, external activities, advocacy with national and multinational institutions, as well as media engagement. And last but not least is Maraikė Oldberg, who is the senior fellow at the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, based in Berlin. Before joining GMF, she worked as an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, where she focused on Chinese media and digital policies, as well as the Chinese Communist Party's influence campaigns in Europe. She is co-author of the book, Hidden Hand, exposing how the Chinese Communist Party is reshaping the world. Extremely grateful for your generosity with time, and it was a really very short notice and much appreciated. Without further ado, my first question will be, just one quick note, please, all for the audience, you can write us any questions, comments, issues you wanna have more talk about in the chat. I will try to read all of them or most of them. We are also live on Facebook, and we will also take questions from Facebook as much as possible. But what will be left in this 1 hour talk, and obviously we cannot cover everything, I hope that all the speakers will be joining us in Tbilisi in October for the China conference, and we will continue this discussion already after 2 months in person and with much larger audience here in Georgia. Let me just go with the question to anybody who wants to start about the general understanding of the strategic cooperation with the People's Republic of China. For a country as small as Georgia, small with the population, small economy, small power, basically. What does it mean? How does it work? And also, what are the big ambitions in the modern world of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as the country as such? And in Georgia, very frequently asked question these days is, why Georgia? Why China even cares to have strategic cooperation with a country as small again as Georgia is?
I think I am the earliest who needs to leave. I can get us kicked off and just give some pointers. So I guess I'm going to talk like a couple of things. One is the overall strategic ambitions, like from the perspective of what I work on. Then why China does those things with countries in general. You know, Georgia is like, of course, part of this is Georgia specific, but part of this is simply something that the PRC pursues with countries around the world. And then last but not least, perhaps the question, does that mean that China can actually, you know, give some kind of security guarantees vis-a-vis like versus Russia, right? So on the overall strategic ambitions, the basic idea is it's very much motivated by domestic concerns. You want to make yourself stable at home in the long run. You want to ramp up your regime security. You want to make sure that the world becomes a place that is safer for the PRC and for the Chinese Communist Party to operate in general, where it becomes easier and safer for them to act internationally, where there's less criticism and more overt support, where there are routes, established trade routes that China controls, that China has maybe built, where it can export its goods, import energy, et cetera, et cetera. So it just wants to have a world that is overall safer for itself. And even though this is primarily a domestic concern, it has global implications because it does make the world in many ways part of this eroding accountability for large countries such as China itself, such as Russia, such as China. So making sure that larger countries within their sphere of influence can be held less to account than they can be right now, where this is justified. Now, there are many reasons why China would want to have this partnership with Georgia. One is China pursues these with a lot of governments around the world, and even if it's a small country, and I think the UN system has a prominent place in the strategic like in the document as well. You know, every country has a vote in the UN system. So if you have somebody that you have this agreement with, that you're expanding your ties with, that might be dependent on the PRC's goodwill in terms of some of the economic benefits, you can have a potential vote in the UN system that you can use accordingly when you need it. You also have the opportunity to show that literally every country around the world, except maybe America and some of those pesky Europeans, are on the PRC's side when it comes to almost any issue, whether it is One China, whether it is any other initiative of the PRC. And this is also where this rhetorical signing on to all these initiatives that you mentioned, such as Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, comes in. At present, there's not much content behind this. At present, it is primarily a rhetorical alternative that is PRC guided, a rhetorical alternative to the present world order that can be filled with content later. And the great thing is, if somebody has already signed on to it, and then it's filled with content that maybe that country's not too happy with, but you can say, but you signed us earlier, clearly you're supportive of this, right? So in a way, it's signing on to something that does not really exist that concretely yet. That is mainly a rhetorical thing right now. Now, of course, there are country-specific interests that the PRC has in Georgia, and I think you probably understand those much better than I do, but there are obvious interests in the deep sea port that is being that is being planned. There are definitely interests from the PRC side in creating alternative trade routes to the northern trade routes for goods to get to Western countries. I think this is also mentioned in the text, that this is like opening up the trade routes to the countries. So you're building an alternative route to the one that has become endangered because of the war, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? You want to have alternatives for the PRC. Then, of course, you may also get some contracts for PRC companies, so which is, again, an additional win. But that does not mean, and I think this is a question that sometimes comes up, that by tightening relationships with China, this is necessarily going to guarantee against Russian interests in Georgia, because ultimately, I think what we have seen, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that the PRC is quite willing to throw smaller countries under the bus. There is, like, Chinese diplomats will frequently call out the difference between big countries and small countries. Will say, like, China is a big country, and you, usually referring to its neighbors and its own neighborhood, or sometimes to Lithuania, you are a small country, and that's a fact. And big countries can simply do things in its sphere of influence. Also, even though relations with Russia are not perfect, Russia is an important building block in the alternative world order that it's referred to as, multilateral, multipolar, as an alternative to a US-led world order. And Russia is an important building block for that. So anything that weakens Russia is considered detrimental to that. So if it's between a big country and a small country, especially a big country that is important from the PRC perspective for this alternative, China is going to side with a big country, with its interests. And this is exactly what we have also seen in Ukraine, where, China also had interests in Ukraine. It had, like, some of the routes, BRI, that went through there. It had good relations. But ultimately, after the invasion, China in all but name supported Russia. Like, officially they're neutral, but it's like a very pro-Russian neutrality, where this is very much supported diplomatically in terms of propaganda, etc., etc. So this kind of building good relations does not offer the kind of assurance that maybe some people would hope for. I'm going to stop here. I think I've talked quite a bit, but I'm happy to, chime in later.
Glenn, please.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Maraika said. I think it's really interesting to look closely at the Strategic Cooperation Agreement, because in many ways it is a microcosm and a perfect example of a framework for a post-Western, post-democratic world order that China has been laying over the last decade, beginning with the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, the Global Development Initiative in 2021, the Global Security Initiative in 2022, and most recently, the Global Civilization Initiative in 2023. This is an alternative architecture of an international order that theoretically China's been laying down and trying to organize countries around, partly to dilute the influence of the post-World War II liberal international order anchored by the United States and Europe. And so this is a critical effort for China to demonstrate that other nations are signing on to this alternative order. It proposes to be anti-hegemonic, multipolar, very tolerant of individual countries, distinctive approaches to democracy. There's an argument that no one size fits all. Every country has its own path towards modernity. There's a very strong sort of neo-Westphalian argument for no country has the right to interfere in the internal affairs of another country or criticize another country on the basis of its human rights record, for example, on its record of media freedom and respect for democratic principles and rights, even for the rights in the UN Charter. And of course, as Maraika said, this is all sort of oriented towards making the world safer for China. With regard to Georgia more specifically, there are a couple of other really, I think, particular interests that China has that make Georgia very important. Yes, it is about securing an alternative trade route around Russia, partly because of the international sanctions that have been applied as a result of the war in Ukraine. But it is even larger than that, because China is trying to secure a land route for trade largely to Europe that would be resistant to any interdiction by the United States Navy in the Indian Ocean in the event of a Taiwan contingency. And so if the United States were able to choke off trade to China in the event of a conflict over Taiwan, That would happen in the oceans, and a secure land route would offer China an alternative to that, so it could continue to access European markets, and in particular markets in Central Asia and Turkey and otherwise that would be critical to sustaining its war effort. So we have to think about it in those strategic terms. Also, this is about neutralizing Georgia's potential as an EU member and NATO member in the Caucasus. It is critical on China's strategic perspective that it contain NATO's expansion into that region. And exerting greater influence over Georgian politics, I think, is a key objective there. And then there's a really interesting sort of dance that's going on between Russia and China now in areas that were traditionally within Russia's sphere of influence. Now that Russia is distracted and is weaker, China is beginning to intrude a little bit more assertively into Central Asia and the Caucasus. And the balance of power and influence between Russia and China are shifting, perhaps in ways that are strategically significant and that we need to watch. And so being attentive to how there's a much larger geopolitical play here is very important. And then finally, I'll say one last thing with regard to the global security initiative that should be that Georgians should pay very close attention to. One of the underlying principles in the global security initiative that is not spoken about overtly in the strategic partnership is this idea of indivisible security. Indivisible security has its origins really in the Soviet Union. It's the idea, and China raises the idea of indivisible security in the context of the Ukraine war to argue that, well, okay, possibly there's a violation of national sovereignty in an aggressive war on the part of Russia, but it is justified because, Ukraine's tilt towards the West, its consideration of EU and NATO membership, threatened the strategic interests of Russia, and consequently this notion of indivisible security legitimated Russia's intervention and launch of a war in Ukraine. And so indivisible security kind of chips away at the idea that national boundaries and sovereignty are sacrosanct. And of course, with respect to Georgia and Russia today, the idea that borders are not sacrosanct is an acute concern. And so I'll let others add to that.
I think Maraikhe and Glenn summarized it very aptly. I may just add a few more points. Now, why Georgia? Why a small state like Georgia? Well, there's all these reasons that have already been mentioned, but it's also that Georgia literally sits in the middle, both geographically and geopolitically. So geographically, it sits on this proverbial middle corridor that has been described already a couple of times. But geopolitically, also Georgia has apparently aspirations to join the Western alliances, namely the EU and NATO. So I think the PRC is only too happy to try to break Georgia away from this trajectory and bring it closer to its own orbit, so to speak. Now, this is quite reminiscent to what has happened in Eastern Europe in the last decade, when there was a similar effort to sort of break Central and Eastern Europe away from its Western allies and bring it closer to China and also to Russia. Now, there was, 10 years ago when this this regional grouping in Eastern Europe, the 16+1 was started, there was a lot of enthusiasm for closer relationship with China. That sounds quite similar to the language and the spirit of the documents that Georgia has just signed in Beijing. Sort of an uncritical approach to all these offerings coming from Beijing without being very clear what you're actually subscribing to. Back in 2012, when the 16+1 was established, most of the Central and East European leaders would sign just about any document with the PRC without examining it closely. So it seems that this is a very similar case, but of course 10 years later, and a lot of things happened in between, and most people and certainly the political leadership in most Central and East European countries have realized that they can't easily sit on these two chairs. They cannot they cannot simultaneously be based in the Western alliances and then play these games with the People's Republic of China. The geopolitical situation has been changing very quickly, and there has been a looming redividing of the world into these two blocks, and that's becoming more apparent by the day, and was certainly re-emphasized with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So in this situation, to try to play both with the West and the East is no longer easy and sustainable in the long run. So this is something that the Central and East European populations and their political leaderships have learned the hard way over the last decade. So it's kind of amazing that the whole war game, the whole scenario would be replayed again in Georgia a decade later. And it also reminds me of another episode in Central and Eastern Europe from about a decade ago, and that was the activities in the region, and specifically in the Czech Republic, of this Chinese company called CEFC, that at one point essentially owned the bilateral relationship between the Czech Republic and China. And then it turned out to be this fraudulent company, basically a Ponzi scheme financially and politically. Their leadership has been accused and later on sentenced in the United States, and ironically, to a certain degree, even in the People's Republic of China itself, of corruption, including large-scale political corruption in places like Africa and the United Nations. So, this is a company that's absolutely toxic. And simultaneously to the Czech Republic, it was at one point very active in Georgia and was actively contacting pretty much the same political leadership that you have now. So it's sort of surprising to see the same political leadership who has made this mistake of getting in cahoot with this really toxic Chinese company, 7-8 years ago, to basically not deriving any lessons seemingly from this particular episode. So I would strongly encourage people in Georgia to revisit this whole CEFC story. There's actually a summary on our website written by our co-host, by our host today, Tinatin Kirashvili. But I believe there's also a Georgian version that has been published in Georgia, and there's been some press coverage. So it's a very instructive lesson in what can go wrong in such a relationship.
Thank you, Martin. Just as a footnote to what Martin was saying for the Georgian audience, this is the company where our current Prime Minister was working in between being Prime Minister of this country. So Georgians know pretty much everything about the elite capture that is happening in Georgia exactly because of that connection. Sorry, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tinatin. And first of all, my condolences really to the Georgian people and the families of the victims on what I understand is a national day of mourning. And thank you for those joining us. Obviously, I very much agree with my colleagues whom I have learned a lot from in the past years. And I would say, especially Martin, thank you so much, because you're raising basically a lot of China watchers across Europe. So when Martin tells a story and anybody interested that's joined us, do listen to it and go and read it, because it's very instructive and might tell you a lot about what's happening. I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues already said. I think, the way this whole deal was actually done is quite instructive as well when we talk about, how the PRC, the CCP is trying to rewrite that international order in its own image in a way, obviously, because it wants to guarantee first and foremost its own hold on power. I think, the way this whole agreement came about, nobody was warned. Tinatin, you told us you knew something was up, but it kind of, came out of the blue. There was no transparency. There definitely was no democratic debate about it. So I think that's very emblematic in and of itself of what such another alternative world order would look like. also for the people on the ground, because everything my colleagues have said about the geopolitical situation is obviously very true, but there's also that side of individual rights, of democracy, which is everything that the CCP seeks to undermine and really combat, both inside its borders, but it's also very much understood, and that's what all these initiatives are also about, you know, the non-interference, the highlighting of trying to rewrite the concepts of human rights and so on through so-called development. Is really shows as a kind of Orwellian future, I would say, that we might be living in the future if this goes on. And I think what's been most interesting is also the timing, right? We know that this year is very important, moving up for Georgia in discussions on EU candidate member status, discussions with NATO. So this coming just ahead of it and really kind of undermining this out of the blue, raising serious questions, must worry us all. And I think it might be interesting, actually, from that perspective. It's obviously a different situation, but I'm speaking today from Italy. I've been living here for a very long time. Everybody's been following, obviously, Italy's, you know, liaison with the BRI initiatives, which was signed in 2019. Again, there was not a lot of debate around it at the time either. It came after a lot of people-to-people diplomacy, as they like to call it, which is again a part of this strategic partnership. So there has been a lot of cultivation within Italian society and in political circles at all levels over many decades. That came to fruition in 2019. This agreement was signed, no debate was possible, a lot of side agreements as well. Now, all of that has definitely not brought any advantage to Italy. What it has done for years is severely undermine Italy's standing as a country within the G7, as a trusted partner within the EU, and even as a trusted partner within NATO. Obviously, COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have kind of, I would say, sped up history in a way. So that's really broken up, opened the debate on the BRI initiative. It's definitely made Italy more concerned and wanting to assure its partners that it is very much set within the transatlantic alliance and partnership. And so it's readjusting. But what has been proving very difficult is, despite the fact that the BRI agreement, the memorandum, in the end, this was only a symbolic agreement, if you will, right? This was not, there were no obligations in it. There were no real rights in it. It was Italy signing up to this geopolitical theme of Xi Jinping that didn't have a lot of content, as we're talking about the other initiatives as well. Italy, a sovereign nation, has the right, you know, to step out of it by the end of this year in December. It needs to notify. The big question is how. So even if today's majority government is very clear, has always been very clear, they do not subscribe to this agreement, they are, I would say, pretty desperate to understand how can they get out of this symbolic agreement. As a sovereign nation, they have the right to it. Yet they know they are going to pay a price. And even if Beijing is actually not in the strongest position, they have a huge trade surplus. So there's a lot where Rome could play with. We see that there's a lot of fear. And again, that people-to-people diplomacy that's been going on for so many decades, you know, both in political circles, media circles, but also with enterprises and so on, is clearly playing a role and pushing a lot on the government to be very careful in how and if it gets out of the BRI. I know everybody's been very celebratory that this is going to happen anyhow. I'd pay a lot of caution still on how that's going to happen and what alternative agreements will come out of it. Because again, it's easy to get in, especially in this untransparent way. It's much more difficult to get out. And in the meantime, you will be paying a very high price with your partners that might actually be much more useful, obviously, for the security of the Georgian people.
I wonder if I could expand on something that Laura and Martin have both said, and that is the great attraction of these strategic partnerships for many countries is the lure of China's market, the idea that there will be significant investment and then opportunities for trade and export for countries. The United States had dreamy eyes about the China market for many years, and that never materialized. In fact, our relationship with China has been deeply asymmetric, and we have an extraordinary trade deficit with China. but so does every other country in the world except Taiwan. And Taiwan's unique because of its grip on semiconductors. The British had their golden era in which the dreams of partnership with China never panned out. Martin can tell you that I think the experience of the Czech Republic was exactly the same. The 17+1 initiative in Eastern Europe, what countries across Africa have found that promises of trade with China have never materialized, at least exports to China. The trade has exploded because the relationship is asymmetric. So it leads to enormous trade deficits and projects that are never completed and huge amounts of debt undertaken for projects that are not economically sustainable and instead make environmental degradation and local corruption much, much worse. And so we see a pattern across the world in which promises of development and promises of investment never yield either the expected returns or they make local problems worse.
Yeah, unfortunately, this country also, although we did not have strategic agreements so far, and it's a first, but we already faced lots of those problems that Glenn was talking about over the years, starting from 2015 mainly. There are dozens of memorandums of understanding between the ministries, government to government, universities, public institutions, and actually very little of it materialized in terms of either FDI or any particular projects where Georgian budget money is not involved. Most of the time, you see lots of China in this country. You see Chinese signs. The whole main road is filled with the pictures, including Xi Jinping's pictures also as a promotion material. But and you have a feeling that there is lots of Chinese investment going on, but in reality, none of these projects are funded by the Chinese investment. It is all your money, actually, the money from the European Union, from the World Bank, EBRD, different international financial institutions funding various Georgia's infrastructure projects that are implemented by the Chinese companies in an extremely untransparent way, and with serious problems, being it for the environment, cultural heritage, or any other important issues. But my follow-up question, and before I ask the question, I'm going to ask the audience to send questions in chat if you have questions, and also if you have comments, you are absolutely welcome as well. My next question is exactly from what most of you were talking about regarding these documents, these sets of principles or policies that are mentioned in our strategic agreement with China, being sort of creating an alternative reality, alternative to the world order as we know it, liberal democratic world order as we know it. What does it mean, in your opinion, in your experience? What does it mean for a country like Georgia in terms of a country with a clearly constitutionally fixed, defined foreign policy priority that is joining European Union and NATO? Let's say GSI, which gives the full set of the principles, basically ignoring NATO altogether and talking about the exclusive security system under the United Nations and no other institutions needed necessary having anything to do in today's world. Where does it get us? Where does it bring us? And as Laura was saying, it's easy to get in, it's difficult to get out, and there are costs to be paid. We know for example, Lithuania's example on all the sanctions and particularly in terms of trade that China instituted. What might be lessons for the next government, for the next political players coming to this country in this relationship? We already have this agreement. It is already a fact. At the same time, we have a constitutional obligation for any government in this country to do everything possible for Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration. How those two go along, and what are the advices you will give to the political class in this country?
I hesitate to offer advice to Georgians only because I'm not familiar with the local situation as much as you are, and certainly it's within, I think, the sovereign right of Georgians to decide their own fate. But one of the advantages of of the strategic partnership really is that it is full of a lot of jargon and high-sounding phrases. But I think, as Maraika said earlier, it really does not commit Georgia to pursue any specific course of action. So there is still significant freedom in principle for Georgians to decide their own fate here. But the political pressure that China will exert, I think, will be significant, saying that your government signed this agreement, which commits it to certain principles, and those principles are in fact opposed to NATO membership. The Global Security Initiative, for example, is explicitly anti-alliance and anti-bloc. Of course, that means anti-Western alliance in China's eyes, because China's creating parallel institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, its own development bank, that are parallel to Western institutions, and it wants to bring countries into those, despite its claims about being anti-bloc. And so I think that is key. It's also an argument in the hands of the PRC for saying that if you've signed on to these initiatives, and if you look at the Strategic Cooperation Agreement, Georgia concedes a lot. It signs on to all of China's major initiatives without any reciprocity from China. And I think this is really key. Structurally, just go paragraph by paragraph in this agreement. And it really shows how Georgia promises a lot and China promises very, very little in return. And so it is about Georgia submitting to China in a great many ways. And I think that should set off alarm bells, because I think it's a sign of the sort of deep asymmetric structure of the relationship that China is trying to establish.
Thank you.
I can maybe chip in. So I also don't want to offer advice to other countries. I barely dare to offer advice to my own government sometimes, but I do think, I mean, one of the problems is that in these documents, also when you outline the Global Security Initiative, there's a lot of language that sounds very pretty and very nice and very peaceful and very wonderful for everybody. But as Glenn has already pointed out, something like indivisible security is really code for, taking the security interests of your local hegemon, in this case for Europe and for Georgia, Russia, into account, and making sure that, they are accounted for and thereby justifying that. Similarly, China will say, China and Russia are forces for peace, because, and the chain of logic here is because China and Russia both stand for for the trend of multipolarity, and multipolarity is by definition good for peace. That is good for peace, right? So you have all this pretty language that you really need to dissect in detail to understand what the political concepts behind it are. And again, at the core of it all really is lack of accountability and lack of enforcement against big countries such as China doing what they feel they need to do internationally to secure themselves. So having no accountability for those countries, not being able to hold them to account for human rights violations, but also for issues such as, when something happens in terms of corruption or other things, that you have no external oversight over that. So it really is a problem in terms of eroding some of the standards and transparency and anti-corruption that some countries have been fighting for. That's unhelpful in that regard. Though again, oftentimes it's not necessarily China always bringing corruption in, and many times it intersects with corruption at home. It certainly does nothing to stop it, right? So no accountability is really key here. And I think, as Glenn has said, there is nothing binding. Like, it's not like there's a treaty has been signed that Georgia now needs to do X, Y, and Z. The lever that China has is it's got two things. It's got the carrots of dangling carrots saying we have access to the Chinese market, or we may, or just the idea that if you're friendly with us, we may be able to intercede on your behalf, which is, again, as I've said before, is I believe nonsense. But then you have the carrots, but then you also have the sticks. If a country then makes a decision that the PRC disagrees with, and there is some kind of economic entanglement, what we've seen in the past couple of years, especially, is kind of the use of economic coercion to specifically go against certain decisions that are like totally a nation's sovereign right to make, but to use its economic power, usually in the form of retaliation against individual businesses, with the hope that those businesses will then lobby their own government. But in some more extreme cases, such as Lithuania, also like wholesale bans on imports and exports from that country. So that is always a risk to keep in mind when actually increasing economic dependence on the PRC or letting key economic or political actors inside the country become strongly dependent on China, because this is not, again, there is no legal mechanism to enforce anything or to say that Georgia can now no longer pursue its alliance with the West and NATO membership, etc. But it can then use economic pressure either on the whole economy or on key sectors of it to try to force compliance with the PRC's preferences, which in this case would clearly be no NATO, because the PRC is against NATO. It goes against NATO all the time. NATO is the problem. It's a relic of the Cold War. It needs to go, etc., right? So it can then use this economic pressure to pressure a country, and this is really the thing why every such additional entanglement needs to be scrutinized, because it can become a lever to limit sovereign decisions of the country in question.
Yeah, one follow-up question to what was already said about the carrots in the document. When Georgia makes all the promises, you don't really have that much from China, and it is unfortunately very well seen on the very first article. Where document talks, basically copy-pastes the phrase from the GSI about the respect for sovereignty of all countries and all borders, but then Georgia promises the one China policy, while there is no reciprocal statement about, as we have, for example, in the partnership charter with the United States or with the UK, where it specifically talks about occupied territories, about the Russian aggression, and so on and so forth. But my question is more about this economic power that Maraikė was talking about, because the only carrot we have in a document, and actually, literally speaking, only promise China gives, is the preferential lending from the Chinese banks for the implementation of Georgian social and infrastructure projects. That's the only sentence that the entire document reads as a promise or as a commitment from the Chinese side. If in your comments, Martin and Laura and others also can elaborate a little bit, what are the experiences? What is this preferential lending policy that Chinese banks are promising to Georgia that we need to be so happy about coming out of this document?
Like I said, there was this, much of the Central and Eastern Europe was very star-eyed about the economic opportunities in a closer relationship with China. And none of that, literally none of that materialized. And in some instances, like specifically in the Czech Republic, the final count, the end result was negative, because the one company that I have mentioned already and that had been so active because it's no longer in existence, had been active in Georgia as well. CEFC only left a pile of debts in its wake. So in the experience of the Czech Republic, the net economic result has actually been negative, and that was one of the reasons why the public opinion and ultimately the political representation turned against this previous China fever that befell the country about a decade ago. But I also wanted to say, maybe to go one step back, all of these agreements that Georgia has just signed with the PRC are formulated in a very vague language, and I think that's by intent. Because this is like it's easy to sign up to all of these phrases, but then you don't realize what they actually mean, right? But it's the proverbial foot in the door. So the more specific demands will come later. You establish the relationship with this vague language, and then you start pushing for more. And you have to be very careful even with this vague language, because there's some terminology that is potentially quite tricky. It seems that one of the things that you have, or your government has signed up to is this one China principle, not policy, but principle. And the principle is a very different thing from the one China policy. The one China principle essentially means the PRC understanding of the one China concept, meaning that Taiwan is part of one China represented by the People's Republic of China, whereas most countries in the world, and certainly all the potential Western allies of Georgia, maintain that they have their own one China policy that basically deals with this Chinese claim and is non-committal on the status of Taiwan. And that is a very consequential difference, and very often it gets lost in the cracks, so to speak, because people don't understand the difference in these minute differences in terminology. So you have to be actually careful from the very beginning. So I just wanted to make this one point.
Thank you. Laura?
Yeah, I'm also going to briefly go back to the previous question, not in terms of recommendations. I also don't want to tell the Georgian people what to do, but I think initiatives as the one you're having today, the briefing notes you've been sending around, the media articles we've seen. So the fact that the Georgian people are actually debating this and are interested in this question and trying to understand what all these concepts means is definitely a great first step actually to address the issue. And I think there's something we can learn. My colleagues have spoken a lot about, you have these kind of very nice sounding words and concepts, and then you see what they actually mean in practice, right? Even in the document, we see again, the PRC highlighting, the need to respect the United Nations Charter and how everything should be based on that United Nations Charter, while, other alliances such as NATO are basically its nemesis. But then when you look actually behind these words and you look at the practice, you see a PRC that is unable and unwilling to actually uphold that very charter when, its other strategic partner without limits, Russia, invades another sovereign nation. So all those words about respect for sovereignty, respect for the UN Charter, when you compare their words with the practice, it's very different. And I think, as you've said, this agreement has now been signed. That's very unfortunate, but there is still that kind of leeway, right, from the words to the practice. So how is this going to be implemented within Georgia? It seems that this government will be very keen to actually create or give that extra leverage to the PRC to create, for example, the mechanisms that Maraikhe talked about, creating extra economic leverage, creating extra dependencies. This is something that Beijing is actively seeking, again, as it seeks to insulate itself from external shocks, so it can do whatever it wants, in particular with regard to Taiwan, but there might be other things as well. So this, I think, is where civil society, but also local politicians, regional politicians. I mean, there's a reason that this agreement also speaks specifically about all those, people-to-people diplomacy at all levels, right? So I think as a civil society in Georgia, I'd go and actually do the same thing and say, we're not going to implement this in practice, or we're going to do our best, to actually stop that from happening, and really working across all those same levels that the PRC clearly will be targeting, has been targeting probably, but will be targeting in the future.
Tin, I wonder if I might expand on something that Martin said, because I think his drawing our attention to the one China principle is critical here for Georgians. China's obsession with Taiwan and arranging or rewriting the principles of global order to sustain its claim over Taiwan has led to some extraordinary things. For example, much, I think, of its discourse with regard to the war in Ukraine is driven by principles that could be extrapolated and applied to Taiwan. But more recently, China's ambassador to France this May said an extraordinary thing. He said that the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia had no legitimate right to independent status as post-Soviet states, very much on the same principle that Taiwan had no legitimate independent status. And the PRC Foreign Ministry, within a few days, walked away from those comments, but they represent a very strong line of argument within PRC foreign policy circles. about as I think Maraika said, the status of small states versus large states, and in particular, the status of states that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. And this should be extremely alarming to Georgians, I think.
Thank you for reminding that. There was actually lots of talk, fortunately, in Georgia about, and the issue was very much discussed, but we did not really hear any concerns from the government side. And Georgia was one of those few countries who actually did not respond to the issue at all. Officially, I mean, from the government side. Otherwise, as I said, there was quite a discussion about it. There is one question in the chat, which says, do you think the Georgian government is unaware of the risks, or do they have their own motives despite the risks? I won't ask you to comment about Georgia's government's motivations, but if we can look at this question from little broader perspective, what motivates governments to go into those deals with China? Particularly, Martin was, for example, saying that a decade ago, all those things happened, right, already, and there was big enthusiasm, both about BRI and 16+, and all those initiatives are not new. But countries, and then there is another experience of disassociation from those initiatives or disappointment with those initiatives. But still there are countries who are willingly going into the same circle, actually into the trap, I would even say. Why? What motivates the governments to act in this, as it looks like, irresponsible way that we see? And unfortunately, Georgian government is part of it as well.
There are a few factors that I think are at play here. The first is that weakly institutionalized electoral democracies have to deliver public goods to their people. All governments need to, and China arrives with loans that are willing to subsidize infrastructure. They bring in their state-owned enterprises. They can build ports, they can build bridges, they can develop mines, they can lay cables very quickly at no immediate cost to the nation, because the nation assumes debt that has to be paid down the road, presumably by another government. That's that government's problem, not the current government's problem. And meanwhile, the current government can point to a new bridge, a new highway, a new railroad, and say, we delivered something to our people. And in an electoral system, that's a positive thing for governments in power. So that's one reason. The second has to do with elite capture and corruption. Around the world, we see governments the interests of the particular members of that government are not always perfectly aligned with the national interest. And so PRC investment provides tremendous opportunities for kickbacks and for corruption locally. And so it can simply be very attractive to those who have the power to sign the deals, because it provides opportunities to enrich themselves at the expense of their nations. And this is a very common thing, particularly in Africa, particularly as I think Martin saw in the Czech Republic. He can speak more about that, in Montenegro and other nations around the world. It's unfortunately, a very common dynamic.
Thank you. Martin, before I give the floor to you, sorry, because Maraikë needs to leave, maybe if you want to tell us like something about it.
Sure. So I can really just second what Glenn already just said. It is a mixture of perhaps not taking the challenges too seriously, but also many politicians not being forced to take those challenges seriously, because again, it's most likely going to hit somebody else and not themselves. And then in some countries, yes, it is about personally enriching yourself, but it can also simply be about wanting to, or really thinking that you can deliver maybe some quick economic development, and that might help you get reelected. Or it can be about, some particular businesses lobbying on behalf of this. This is a case in Germany where there's like a very small number of quite large, quite influential businesses that have a lot of sway over the German government, or at least over parts of the German government. So you might want to make some of those people happy. happy. So the individual motivations can really differ, but it is usually a mixture of not being forced to take the consequences too seriously, being unaware of the negative consequences or not fully aware of it, and then having economic motives of varying degrees, from personally enriching to yourself to simply needing to deliver on the economic front for your voters, right? And I apologize for having to drop off early. I need to go on another call, unfortunately. But thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion. It's been really helpful for me as well.
Thank you. Martin?
Yes, I think, again, Glenn summarized it very nicely. So I would only add that between these two ways of influencing the situation in the target countries, that is in between economic benefits and the elite capture in Central and Eastern Europe, we've really only seen the latter, that is the elite capture. You know, there were no new bridges outside of the Balkans, but that's a different story. No new bridges or no new construction projects, but a lot of elite capture. And now I would again like to remind everybody that a big part of that elite capture was one specific Chinese company, CEFC, that has even been convicted at court in the United States of political bribery in Africa and in the United Nations. Now, the fact that the very same company was so active in Georgia, engaging very high positioned politicians in Georgia would probably make me quite nervous if I were a Georgian citizen.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question about the Georgia and US relations. Are there indications of how this may affect the relationship between Georgia and the United States? And I will read one more question as we are getting to the end of it. It's a very interesting question, actually. In your opinion, Xi Jinping's meeting with Garibashvili somehow coordinated with Russia? Is there any possibility for that? Or all these developments were completely unexpected for Russia as it is for Georgian society? Maybe we don't answer it directly because, of course, we don't know it, but in terms of, if we generalize this question in terms of the Russia-China coordinating actions, decisions, cooperations in formerly Russia's neighborhood, that will be an interesting insight to know what is the experience, what does experience say about it. Laura, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, maybe I'd actually also like to hear from Glenn on the first question, how the US will treat this. And I don't know, Tina, I'll actually rebut with a question. I don't know if there's been any official statement or response from Brussels, for example, yet. I think that might be an interesting part of the discussion. And why haven't we seen a response yet? So what's going to happen there? Regarding the cooperation, I have no idea. I think maybe Martin or Glenn are more knowledgeable to see that, to say something about that. We've seen across, let's say, the whole since Russia's invasion of Ukraine started, and obviously already before, we've seen that there's been continued dialogue, there's been continued high-level visits, there's consistent evidence of the PRC supporting Russia to shield it against some of the effects of the Western-led sanctions. There's obviously been support in terms of dual-use goods, both for civil and military use to Russia. So it's very clear that the PRC is willing to continue playing a supporting role to Russia. And I think that should make anybody in their immediate neighborhood very, very concerned, especially when we see these kind of initiatives that are aimed at undermining NATO, basically, at undermining the EU. And in all of this, we know that the PRC seeks to divide and conquer. All the initiatives were talked about, the BRI, like with Italy, the 16+1 in Eastern Europe, these kind of strategic partnerships, they really aim at kind of dividing countries so that bigger countries, such as China in particular, can take the lead. So anything that happens in that direction, we should be worried about. And even if it's not coordinated with Russia, I can imagine that Russia might be quite happy with this kind of development and what it might lead to.
Thank you. Glenn, Martin?
You know, there's a saying in Southeast Asia that when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. There's this idea that small nations in particular can somehow use the geopolitical rivalry between larger nations to their advantage by playing to all sides and trying to get the best bargain they possibly can. I think in the sharpening geopolitical climate of today's world, that's a very dangerous position for a small country to be in. In particular, countries are being increasingly forced to make choices or being pulled in directions against their will simply because of the economic and political pressures that are applied towards them. So I think it's impossible to know specifically whether China and Russia coordinated on this. But I would also say that while it's easy to see how one could pose China and Russia on one side and the United States and Europe on the other side with Georgia in the middle, I think there's a much more complicated dance going on between China and Russia in the region. One that in the short term, I think it helps Russia because it has a new ally in the region to shore up its interests. But in the longer term, erodes Russia's interests in the region and will probably be to Russia's detriment as nations in Central Asia and the Caucasus see that perhaps China can be a hedge against Russia. And so it's an extremely complicated set of forces that are in play here, but a very dangerous one also for smaller nations.
Martin?
Well, in Central and Eastern Europe, we had the very same question, like how much coordination there actually is between the People's Republic of China and Russia in the region. Because obviously there was some, but it was not reflected in any public documents. There was nothing in the public domain that would spell it out in any detail. Whereas on the ground, you could see that it was actually happening, that they were coordinating their steps, because otherwise they would step on each other's toes. Central and Eastern Europe, just like the Caucasus or Central Asia for that matter, traditionally was the quote-unquote backyard of the Russians in the times of the Soviet Union, at least. And then China started pushing in. So, in order for Russia and China not to step on each other's toes, not to hinder each other's efforts and interests, there had to be some kind of coordination, except it wasn't publicly visible. There is, however, one region where it is more visible than in other regions, and that's Central Asia. Because in Central Asia, it took a couple of decades for China and Russia to come to a certain understanding. And in that region, it's relatively well documented, both in mutual treaties between China and Russia, and also with all sorts of statistics and in-depth studies. So I think Central Asia is a good example to show that there is this coordination between the two powers in this potentially contested areas, bordering both of these powers. But the specific details are very, very hard to establish.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, for being with us, for joining us. Once again, I will mention we hope to see you in October at the conference as well, and have even more discussions, more talks about these issues. Just for those of you who are listening to us, I will share for a second a screen of our website where you can see as we were talking about coordination between Russia and China, particularly on Ukraine issue. We've just published our report on PRC's peace game, The War in Ukraine, that we've tried to put together all the statements, all the meetings, all the activities that were going on in the region over this year and a half. And I hope you'll find it interesting to get some answers to your questions as to the level of coordination and level of support Russia is actually getting from Chinese in this absolutely aggressive war that it started against Ukraine. Thank you very much. This is the end of our discussion, and we hope to continue as the developments will go. There is an expectation that September is going to be very active between Georgian and Chinese governments. There will be lots of treaties signed, lots of agreements signed, lots of promises made. And at the end of October, there is a big Silk Road Forum planned in Tbilisi with 2,000 Chinese delegates coming here. We will see all the details of the papers and documents of this agreement. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.